Hi, we're live at the Barrel Room again, our second rendition of some fun wine education from Traverse City, Michigan, and our friend Brian Ulrich, winemaker and owner at Westwood Charlie in Traverse City, the only urban winery up here, generously lent us his space. Last time it was a fun little debate about the best red variety to grow up here. Today it's about production methods. It's the season for bubbly. It seems cliche. Some of us think it's the best breakfast wine. Others will course it out throughout an entire meal. I'm going to give you a breakneck, like at breakneck speed, an introduction to 3 specific and different methods of sparkling wine production. Super quick. Take notes or not. We'll send you a whole document if you'd like more information later. And then the winemakers for each of these 3 wines are going to join me after. And then we have a special surprise at the end for our newest winemaker to our region, whose bubbles are his favorite. And we'll kind of close things up with a Q&A after. So first, and bear with me here, we're going to talk about traditional method. Some people call it Methode Champenoise, which is from Champagne. All Champagne is sparkling wine. Not all sparkling wine is Champagne. Quickly, how that's made is every wine is made by starting with picking grapes. In the case of something like this, usually a little bit early to retain that acidity, fermenting it, and you have like a enamel stripping, high acid, often delicious and difficult to drink base wine, but it needs to get those bubbles. And the only way to get great bubbles is by not force carbonating it. So we're not going to discuss that method at all. For traditional method sparkling wine, the key to that is the second fermentation happens in the bottle. So fermentation is yeast eats sugar, the byproducts, alcohol, heat, carbon dioxide. If you can trap that carbon dioxide through that process, then you get bubbles in sparkling wine. Yeast also, as it dies, yes, it's a morbid process, but it's a spectacular one. As it dies, all those little yeast carcasses sort of fall to the bottom of whatever vessel the fermentation is taking place in. And the more contact, the more surface area, if you will, contact the wine, the juice, the liquid has with those dead yeast cells, the more that character it picks up, which makes a great deal of difference in terms of texture, complexity, etc. So all that happens in the bottle, capsule in here. It's like this. All the yeast die after creating all the wonderful fermentation that puts the sparkle in the bottle, and then some brilliant person, either a drill palette, which is a big piece of machinery, or a riddler in a cellar, does this process called Remoulage and gets it on its head, so to speak. You freeze the neck. It creates this like very big frozen plug in the neck of the bottle. Pop off the crown cap at that point. Contents under pressure. Shoots it out, and you have some wine left that needs to be topped up. When Brian comes on, we'll talk about dosage and the different sweetness levels, but ostensibly, that's how bubbles get in traditional method, our first method, traditional method sparkling wine. Some would argue the most refined, elegant, complex of the 3 methods we're discussing today. But like anything, there's a place for everything, and it's fun to be able to explore the different styles. Second method that we're going to discuss with Sean O'Keefe from Amie Vineyards is the Methode Ancestrale or Methode Rurale, where that same process basically occurs, but instead of doing a second fermentation in the bottle, so alcoholic fermentation, bubble fermentation, it's that same little family of yeast that does all the work for Methode Ancestrale. And what you get is a little bit less of that autolytic character, but a process, I'll let Sean, he'll be poetry when you hear him talk about it. This is actually the oldest method for, and the most rudimentary, if you will, for that natural second fermentation or first fermentation where the bubbles come from the initial introduction of yeast, whether that happens naturally just through ambient yeast or through inoculation. And then finally, you have a method that's almost identical to the traditional method, except imagine like all the character of teeny tiny bottle, but I'm going to do that in a giant tank. And so the same thing happens, but in a large tank, so you don't pick up all that character of the yeast in the Charmat method. Again, I have 3 minutes to do this. I think I'm pretty much there. We'll explore those methods as we talk with each of the winemakers, and the girls on tech support are more than happy to send my sort of bullet pointed document that actually explains these. Before we start talking to everybody, I want to say there's a place for all the styles, a place for all the methods. It's hard to rival actual champagne at the top tier of champagne, but many of the best traditional method wines, and we're going to taste one of them right now, will absolutely, in terms of quality, character, texture, and just general great backstory. Brian's tripping over himself over right now. Rival some of the base champagne for sure, and Italy is one of those at that level. Brian!
Starting gun.
Sorry, I didn't bring my gun.
I'm going to be recording sitting down. That's why I was antsy. Well, thanks for having me.
Cheers!
Appreciate it.
Actually, you're having me, it's your thing.
Well, I wasn't here, so.
So Italy, how would that breakneck speed? Probably not enough information. The traditional method, and you're the first one here.
Today, yes.
Right.
Not the first to do this, for sure. So this is a 100% Chardonnay, small vineyard we planted on Old Mission. 1 acre, with the design to make a traditional method sparkling wine. And by that, what we're looking for is a vineyard that can ripen fruit to a point where it gets kind of the requisite potential for alcohol and acid without getting too much in terms of varietal character, where the wine can be dominated by whether it's fermentation qualities or, I don't know, kind of base estery type results of really ripe fruit. Plus, we don't want real high alcohol. So we're trying to keep the fruit minimally ripe so that when it comes to finally the alcohol comes in balance, because that whole dosage process adds alcohol.
So quickly, I did mention it because I knew we would talk about that when we talk about dosage. There's that second fermentation. So just to slow it down since I have you here, right? It's regular wine at the beginning. Regular old white wine.
Well, yes, but we're picking it, and we grew it on this particular site because we felt like we could kind of find that balance point between the proper amount of sugar, but still have good acidity to make a sparkling wine. And then at that point, we're whole cluster pressing. We're trying to keep the wine light. And the deeper you dig into skins, and we do a lot of stuff with skins here, that's when you can get into a lot of crazy mouthfeel and aromatics and things. And that's not what this wine is about. We're trying to keep this one more on the pure side and very clean and transparent and delicate. And so by having that site and growing it that way, we kind of set our course years ago to make wine. And then the fermentation is very normal.
So I just wanted to ask a quick visual. So when you talk about all those things in the transparency, right, you don't want to add a lot with skins and whatnot, but you are adding a great deal of character by aging it for an extended period of time.
Oh, yeah, right. That's where
Can you talk about that, the entourage?
Yeah, so the fermentation is normal, and we're trying to just get it dry, basically.
The baseline.
The baseline, right. And then we kind of let it settle down. We rebottle. We're going to be doing the current vintage probably in February, I would guess. Probably should do it earlier, but it'll be at least February. And at that point, that's when we're trying to set the stage for what's going to develop later. And so in the bottle, the yeast are, again, being asked to re-ferment any sugars. We're going to add sugar to it, and yeast, and let that action go on again, but in a closed system. So,
and in the closed tiny system of 750 milliliter bottle.
Yeah, and so the bubbles are going to form. The early stage of it is just a pure fermentation, but as that pressure builds, the yeast is under pressure. They're going to have to, finish it off, and they will eventually, but it's going to take time. So we're pretty patient. We're aging these on their sides, as you're talking about.
Sur Labs, yeah.
Yeah, so we lay them down, and the idea is that the yeast are still kind of alive and sort of starting to go to sleep.
Well, you still see at this point in the bottle, and I didn't think to have one out, but it's basically you see like the sludge, if you will, all that a little graveyard of yeast.
For sure. But in that death process, it's not so much a slaughter as it is a hospice, and we're trying to get the yeast to sort of collapse on themselves, and they kind of act as a filter, which would then allow some of the really beneficial textures and flavors to come out through the cell walls, which then will impact the wine. And so that aging process of 2 to 3 years in our case is really set so that we can achieve that kind of concept of graceful kind of decline of the yeast, which should add some body, should help with the bubbles, it should add some of the aromatics and give you a little bit of that toasted yeast quality that we love in great sparkling wine. And then from there, you have the disgorging, a whole other game.
So with this particular wine, and just to take it back to champagne, because I feel like people really know champagne, or at least they think they do. They call champagne, like some people think all sparkling wine is champagne. We know that that's not true. And champagne could arguably be the holy grail of sparkling wine, if you will. But for me, I like to treat each of them individually and decide what do I want for this purpose, this time, what I'm eating, the occasion, what have you. And so talking just specifically about this method that is the same method that's employed in champagne, arguably like gold standard, the most expensive, the longest, the most difficult, the one with the most potential for error, arguably, because there's so much time, or maybe not.
Or maybe it's more forgiving.
Maybe it is because you have so much time.
Yeah, time dilutes echoes, right?
But there's two things that I think are really important. Number one, the feeling and texture of the bubbles themselves, which is distinct in all of these, which will be fun to explore as we talk with the other winemakers. But the second thing too is sweetness. And we talk about that. So this is Chardonnay, 100%. It could be a Blanc de Blanc style from Champagne. It's made in the same method. How long was this on the leaves, the little dead yeast cells? Those are the leaves. Dosage. And do you think of Champagne, when you, like the actual region of Champagne, when you're making a wine like this?
Yes, I am naive enough to think we can make great champagne.
Champagne.
So I'm going
I
after
love champagne.
naive and champagne. No, yeah, of course. That's the whole impetus. I didn't make sparkling wine for a long time because I was scared, and we dabbled into it. I mean, this is only 140 cases or something, so we're not like massive producers.
139.
But it's still, was it? All right.
So I just said.
Yeah. So it's still in that process of learning. But yeah, the goal is to be able to come up with, I mean, our climate and what we have our sort of set to do naturally really lends itself to making sparkling wine. And so to not explore it sort of seemed like I was just trying to hide from, you know, the inevitable in a sense. And what we're looking at in terms of style and dosage and body, that changes year to year. This is 2017. We are making vintage bottlings at this point because it is so small. I really don't have enough to save and do house cuvee style things. So it's vintage to vintage, and this particular one has no dosage, I believe. I looked up my notes prior to it, and I did one electronic note I had on my phone said, I will send the dosage information with the wine. So I don't have the record, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure we went 0 on this one, so there's no sugar. But this was 17 was a year that we had lower acidity. And so there's years where it could be really racy acidity that might want a little balance, might help lift some of the qualities of the wine. And so with the Brut style we're making with Guittali will tend to be in about the 84 to 7 gram range. So yeah, 0.4%.
Well, and Brut's one of those styles where it's like a pretty big range. I think it's like 0 to 12 or something, right? But it's like this is a no dosage, so this is somewhere probably in that 0 to 3 grams per
We
liter.
didn't add, so it'd be, yeah, whatever the wine fits, it got to be 0.
So we can explore dosage, and if anybody has any questions for afterwards, it's a very important part of the traditional method as we go through what they use in Champagne, what you see all over Contracorta, many other regions. But last thing I want to talk about just the bubbles, size, texture, that feel. Why do it this way? Why do it this way, more difficult way? What do you see as the difference between, say, this and like forced carbonation? I mean, I know that's an extreme.
Well, so there's a certain amount of laziness involved in making sparkling wine. And if I get this bottled in January, I don't have to worry about it for 2 years. So I can just lay it down, and that's not totally making that up. I mean, there's a certain patience thing that goes on that's really nice. Just let it do its own thing. Yes, the bubbles that you get tend to have a creamier context, and I think that really helps the overall perception of the wine. Ours, in particular, we also have a lower dosage, or I'm sorry, lower tirage level where we're going in, so we're already kind of setting ourselves for a little less volume of CO2. to avoid kind of the overly expressive, maybe eruptive style that might come if I, that's kind of backing your way into learning things and trying to figure out how the bubbles actually relate. And one of the crazy things about this is that, we make these decisions, in this case, 2018, January 2018, I'm making these tirage decisions, and I'm just now being able to ascertain that I did something right in 2020. We were tasting a 2009 the other day, same thing. It's just such a long learning curve that everything we're embarking on is part of join us in the process and learn how this is all going to kind of end up in the bottle and present the glass ultimately.
I've had the pleasure of tasting this from its inaugural vintage all the way through, and some of the baselines and the process and all the things, and it really is a pleasure. We'll have an opportunity to talk to Brian again later.
New Year's Eve Day, we're opening the 2009 and the 2010 vintages in the tasting room. People come by.
You want to tell everybody that?
I think I just did.
I know.
It's a true story, though.
Come at 10 a.m. 10 a.m.
No, 11.
No, I'm an early riser. I'm here at like 8. I want to thank you, Brian, and there'll be another opportunity, like I said, to ask questions specifically about the traditional method. But I want to just review my breakneck speed introduction to the different production methods. And Sean O'Keefe is going to join us after he can properly distance. Okay. Talking about Methode Ancestrale, now this is one of the more obscure wines. Like I said, you're welcome to the doc. I mean, no one really talks about this. There's a new sort of movement where you're seeing a lot more Pétillant Naturel, petnats and whatnot, but this is not really, I don't know. You can argue about that all day long. Anyway, so this has a second fermentation that takes place in the actual bottle, which is the one that gives it just a little more alcohol and its carbonation. This is one single fermentation, a continuous fermentation that gives it both its alcohol content and is captured part of the way through bottles, and then it's allowed to continue, and that's what gives it the bubbles.
Sure. So this is a Riesling. This is not a traditional champagne grape. So I didn't decide when I want to make this wine. I grew up making Riesling, learning about Riesling. And I wanted to do something that was really particular and actually make a sparkling wine that worked around Riesling's properties and not necessarily what the champagne makers were doing, which is kind of funny because most of the champagne makers, you look at their last names, they're all German. So the Germans have a long history of working with bubbles.
Well, and Riesling in particular, right?
Yeah. Well, when I was in school in Geisenheim, the wine school in Germany, it was very common to have sex parties. Be careful how you tone that, but it was sparkling wine was
S-E-K-T.
Yes.
Just S-E-K-T.
Yes. So people would have full, with no beer or wine, just having these beautiful sparkling Rieslings and things. To me, it was always very intriguing, and I never really did much for a long time. I think I heard Brian saying too. A lot of it's just kind of it's a whole other subset of winemaking that requires whole other way of looking at things and thinking about things. It's different than how we make still wines. It's something, if you have a little respect for that, you don't just delve into it and just kind of, or dabble into it. You have to kind of, build some information up about that.
Can I ask you a quick question
before
you? So I agree that you really have to delve into it. I mean, it isn't like a fly-by-night decision to do something like that. So people know the traditional method. I mean, people understand champagne. Even the Charmat method, which we'll talk about Michael in a minute, but people are knowing Prosecco. Prosecco's actually started. You did this version that is very rarely seen. Even though it seems to be getting popular, it still is not seen nearly in the volume.
Well, there's a lot of Venn diagrams overlapping right there. There's things called Pétillant Naturels or petnats. There's the Methode Ancestrale and I guess traditional method. There's a lot. My wine kind of overlaps in all three, even though Pétillant Naturel is apparently equal to method. It's complicated. The point being is my goal in this was not necessarily partly, but part of it was not to just make pure non-interventionist wine. I mean, to make non-interventionist wine, I'd have to sit underneath a rotten grape cluster while a bee stung it, and I already ate it, and then have the juice drips in my mouth, and then maybe that would be the most natural way to do things. But I do admire a lot of this kind of minimalism that seem to be kind of, being very in the mode right now. And with Riesling especially, like when we do Rieslings or dry Rieslings or sweet Rieslings, we never We try to, it's one of those grapes, it's like Pinot Noir or Gamay Noir and Chardonnay that really exists very well on its own as a variety. It doesn't need to be blended or other things. And so when I want to make sparkling wine, I wanted to have it just the grapes, not worry about making little dosages and other things. And part of it was to address a lot of these pet nats that I had tried. That in their worst format, they're these cloudy wines that can be really fun to drink, especially in the first couple of months after harvest. And this is what people have traditionally done in Germany and Austria and anywhere they make wine, where they these cloudy wines are bubbly, Weiss or Sturm, as they call it in Austria. And I love those things. But to bottle it and try to send it off across overseas, across state lines, I just don't accept that.
Well, I want to talk about that because it is that sort of zeitgeist, right? Like that instant picture. Like that's the time, right then and there, and it's really only meant, not unlike Beaujolais Nouveau, but that's another.
In a way it is though.
But it's right then and there. It's really only designed for a short period, and then what happens? I mean, how many times have you tried to pop the...
And it gushes, and you open it up, and you have to slowly just, and it's kind of cool the first couple times, but then you're like, this is like, how do I sell to a restaurant where they want to actually pour something for somebody? Or even more so, we talked about, I heard you guys talking, is the bubbles don't stay in solution. So if you open up a bottle, cap it, and then open up in the morning, it's flat. And is that bad? Or is that necessarily a positive thing? I don't know. I'm not here to maybe a little bit on some of that movement.
Yeah, you totally are.
I don't like quality wine, but I like some of the things that people are pushing in the sense of not of trying to pick a wine at the right point, be fermented with just the sugars that it has and the flavors it has, and add nothing, no other juice or other things to it, especially with Riesling. But I wanted to disgorge the wine, so basically I riddled it and basically disgorged the whole bit, or with the help of 2 lads, obviously, who have the equipment to do those kind of things. And in my case, I did a couple different things for Riesling that make it different from the other ones. Riesling has natural acidity to it already, and also it has varietal character, meaning when they pick grapes in Champagne, or be Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, Chardonnay, these kind of things, they pick them at the early part of ripening where it's all structure, it's all the acids, it's other things, with very little over fruit character. I could pick Riesling at a very, very low ripeness, it's going to taste like Riesling. Why fight that? But at the same time, a lot of the sparkling Rieslings I've tried have been these kind of like, no offense, Prosecco, but kind of, oh, we got a lot of extra Riesling, just bubble it up, make it sweet. And I love that edginess that, as Stuart Piggott, the winery, would say, that Blade Runner aspect of Riesling. So I wanted to play that aspect of having a brut style. And I also didn't want to do anything to it. So we picked it a little bit riper than the Champagne grapes would be. Usually they would be at 15, 16 bricks. I picked this at 18, maybe 18 and a half bricks.
Relying, just to review for everybody, on the natural acidity that Riesling has.
Yeah, it's there. And also, knowing that I'm not going to add any sugar later, I don't have to worry about the alcohol being too high. So in most cases, we don't ferment it with traditional yeast. I usually start it with a yeast that is normally fermented to 2, 4, 5% alcohol. It's called Rules for Del Brookie. And then I just
everybody write that down. It's really important. It's really important.
Well, for my winemaking, it is. But and then I just let whatever, that only goes for a few percentage, and then whatever's floating on the cellar kind of makes it go. But what I like about that is that this is what winemakers traditionally use on red wine grapes when they're running on the skin, just to give them a little peace of mind that there's something fermenting that's keeping all the bad stuff from happening, meanwhile letting whatever's floating around the winery have a chance to get in there. And so it's not pure that way, but I kind of like some of the flavors came out of that. So we wait until we have about down to about maybe 22 grams per liter sugar. That gives about 4.5 bar atmospheres, where traditional champagne is like 6 atmospheres. And the reason we do that is, it's hard to stop these fermentations and get them to, and I've always gone a little bit drier, but I found out from that is with all that natural acidity and Riesling and the low pH and things, if I had, when you carbonation, the bubbles create a sense of acidity and sharpness in wine. I don't need that in Riesling. It'd be almost searingly if I was going to do, which I do no dosage, where it's going to be bone dry. So a little bit less carbonation, not so much like Charmat, which would be even lower, but somewhere between Charmat and Moussel or traditional champagne. And I think that works really well for it.
So I want to pause just for a second too, and just talk about the grape varieties, talk about the traditional champagne varieties, the three, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier.
Yeah.
But I want to talk, Riesling to me, when I talk about it, teach about it, drink it, think about it, read about it, all the things, is a grape that is absolutely transparent. It shows the place it's grown as well or better than any other grape on the planet. And that's why I feel like it needs so little intervention, right? It isn't a palate like Chardonnay is a palate in the playground for a winemaker.
Well, what do you mean by intervention?
Anything, really. I mean, to me, Riesling, you don't really want to put, oh, I'm Riesling, right?
Oh, no intervention.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Better not to, because to me, like Chardonnay is a blank slate for a winemaker. Riesling, not so much.
No,
right? I want Riesling to show, as a consumer, as a buyer, I want Riesling to show its place. So when you're making a sparkling Riesling like this, when you think in terms of transparency, people are going,
absolutely. The biggest decision I make on picking Riesling, whether still or sparkling, is when I pick it. I mean, all the vineyard decisions, and then when you pick it, and when you're picking for acidity, not just like when people get caught up in the game here in cooler climates like Michigan, where they keep on looking for the amount of sugar that's coming in the grape and ripe. No, you have to pick for some more subtle structural things, and that's something that both Brian and I and others have gotten pretty good at over time. And
I mean, arguably not pretty good. I mean, you have decades now of Riesling production.
Yeah, we're pretty good.
Yeah,
we're
doing great.
We're good. Yeah. So what I want to do is it's been a lifelong mission to also get dry Riesling going, because people always associate Riesling in this country with sweeter wines. And gosh, they make the most beautiful sweet wines that have residual sugar in the world. I mean, with that balanced acidity and sugar side. I'm not saying anything against that. Otherwise, Brian's going to come down and yell at me, but I agree with him on that. But to actually get all that flavor of Riesling, but dial it down a lot. There's so much fruit and all that in there. I don't need it all. And to actually make something that's a little bit more cutting edge and a little bit more restrained and just built around that natural acidity of Riesling is my favorite thing. And that's where the name comes from, Simplicissimus. It's this whole method of doing this methadance straw, which is, like you said, it's not perfect, because I do actually will add, sometimes I'll add yeast in the beginning or in the secondary tirage fermentation, but it's all the juice from the very beginning, and there's no dosage at the end. It's zero sugar left over. And I call it Simplicissimus because Simplicissimus is a very hard way to say something simple. And to make this wine, it sounds like it's a more simple, easy way to do things. It's much more harder, because you have to nail that sugar at the right point and stop that fermentation. It really wants to continue to the end and get everything going and not have all the ability to course correct later. And it's really difficult. I think it'd be easier though for a Riesling than if I was to do that with Chardonnay. I don't think a Chardonnay would be as interesting.
I agree, and I think, as we said about transparency, we'll have an opportunity to talk with Sean later about his method, and I would argue also the transparency of Riesling, because I think this is actually just a beautiful expression of that. And the trend toward pet nat and whatnot. But we are going to now address our next production method with our friend Michael Lane. Thanks, Sean. We'll see you in about 10 minutes. So we talked about the Charmat method, which has more in come on, sit down, but I do need some of that delicious there in front of us. While we have a moment, I want to just say thank you to, we have Meredith, Christy, and Elena in the wings that are assisting with all the tech support and everything else. So if anything is terrible, tell them. Michael Lane from bigLITTLE and Maudy Wines, really a neat show. It's an interesting, we should give a little bit of a shout out to Larry, who was the first person to do spectacular traditional method sparkling wine in this area 4 decades ago and then some. Michael and his brother Peter are doing a great job of keeping that going, as well as creating your own identity with certain wines. And now, when we talk about production method, it's an interesting thing to go through these. So it's more like, if you think this is actual, with this, there's no secondary fermentation in the ancestral. Here, with traditional method, there's a secondary fermentation that takes place in this teeny tiny little vessel, like the one that you see right here. For Charmat, the second fermentation, the one that gives it its bubbles and just a little more alcohol, takes place in a larger tank. So you don't have all of that. Now, as someone who specializes in Italian wine, I deal with a lot of Prosecco. I want to say that Prosecco has become a brand. Right. And not always a great one. Fair?
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, but there are fantastic Prosecco producers who are owning that method and making great wine out of it because they want to make great wine in that method, right? Not everybody needs that proofing, yeasty, red dough all the time. Right? And I really like the quality. I want you to talk about that. It's simpler and less expensive, but it isn't a lesser method. It's its own thing, its own identity, and I'm curious about what that means.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. Good to see you after
Pleasure.
quite some time. You know, not really corresponding with our peers as much these days, but it's good to see everybody. My name's Mike Lang of Mauby Sparkling Wines. I just finished my 14th harvest, actually, which is kind of surprising, but I've been up here for a while, and then I launched bigLITTLE with my brother in 2010. And we make a couple sparkling wines at bigLITTLE. We make a bottle fermented wine called C3 Pinot, and we make Tire Swing. And of course, at Mauby, we make a lot of Charmat or cube close or bulk process method wines. But that process, very similar to the bottle fermented process, up to the point of actually bottling, or in this case, you know, moving the wine to a pressure tank to re-ferment and not age for very long. So that's kind of where the method starts to stray.
So quickly though, it's not so much re-ferment, but like a second ferment.
Yeah,
second ferment. Like this is more of a continuing, right? Because it's at like the bubbles. You have your, to simplify it, alcoholic fermentation, give me the bubbles fermentation. Right?
Well,
that's the simplification, but you do add liqueur de tirage in order to create that second, like for a traditional Charmat method, or are you making it in a different way?
No, we dose the wine with 19 grams per liter of sugar. So every 4 grams per liter gives you about a bar of our volume of pressure. So yeah, we start a yeast culture. We grow that population to about 50 million cells per milliliter, and then we dose with 19 grams per liter for Charmat, about 24 grams per liter of residual sugar for the bottle fermented wines. So Sean was sort of in the middle here with 22 grams per liter, so he was talking about that. 19 grams per liter of sugar, and then you know, it takes about 10 days, 2 weeks to re-ferment in the pressure tank, versus about a month in tirage to re-ferment a bottle fermented sparkling wine. We're lower temperature, slower ferment with bottle fermented, and we're trying to make sure we have a clean, fast, steady fermentation with a cube close or Charmat product. And then we remove from the yeast onto a dosage and bottle. So there's not that yeast complexity, but we've employed some techniques here with Tire Swing to kind of cheat a little.
Yeah, tell me about it. First of all, grapes.
Yeah, grapes. So 75-25 Riesling Gewürztraminer. And we really try to use aromatic varieties, or at least best with Charmat process, because you're not covering up that fruit with yeast as you age in the bottle over time. And you can use some tailed fractions, some harder press fractions, to get a little bit more of that aromatics and texture. I don't know. We use more aromatic varieties like Riesling, Gewürztraminer. At Mauby, we're not scared of hybrids.
In line.
So what we do here is we use a third reserve wine. So we keep reserve wines back, sort of like what Larry does with Houseman. That's why I learned it. Of course, he was my mentor. He still is. But we keep a third of the reserve wines back. So we're getting some of that sort of complex aged Riesling character here by employing the reserve.
And what are you holding it in, tank?
So we're holding it in stainless, yeah.
So it stays pretty much inert, like there's no any further influence except that.
Riesling takes on more petrol notes as it ages, and so we get some of that here. I have actually left this in Charmat tanks for a few months and stirred on the lees to kind of mimic a bottle fermented effect, if you will. So I've done that as well. But yeah, so that reserve component really changes this wine and sort of overlaps, because a lot of the Champenois use reserve wines to build house style and to maintain consistency. We do at Mauby as well on all of our bottle fermented.
So now Prosecco is probably the best known brand Charmat method wine, et cetera, right? And there's obviously differences. I mean, there's very base, not when you cook with it, Prosecco, and then there's, wow, that is stunningly good.
Right.
Right.
Same with grower champagne, I would argue.
you shooting for something with this? Like, do you think, are you like, you chose, I mean, you make wine, sparkling wines of both styles, both methods, but are you shooting for something specific with this, or are you just trying to rock the aromatics? We talked about the transparency of Riesling with the Simplicissimus.
Yeah. Well, I want to showcase Riesling here because it's a variety that grows well here and that we love. So I'm just taking a different approach. I really like that aged character that we get from the reserve wines, but I like the crisp acidity as well. And the Gewürztraminer sort of helps make it different. It's not 100% Riesling, so there's something else there.
You said 75-25.
75-25, yeah. Also, from the nature of, from a kind of a marketing perspective, the bigLITTLE tasting room is on the property at Mauby, and in some ways we're competing with those Mauby flavors, and we've got to set ourselves apart in some way. So, yeah, this is actually, I can explain a little bit about how this wine was born. I made this wine off of a vineyard and off of Old Mission in 2009. And that was my first time making wine on my own, and it wasn't that great. So I kept the wine to the next year, blended that with 2010, and made a lot of improvements. And so that blending style was sort of born out of trial and error, as you know, a lot of our decisions are as we experiment with these varieties and styles. So
well, and on the fly.
Yeah.
Like, let's do this right now.
Yeah, so that's kind of how that wine was born, and we took that and ran with it and keeping. So this has some wine from 2009 in it.
Fun.
When I made that first batch of bigLITTLE.
So interesting too is the 25% Gewürztraminer. We talked about like picking early to preserve acidity, right? In the grapes there, having a grape that has naturally high acidity, you can let it go a little longer. Likewise, primarily Riesling, but Gewürz is the opposite, right? Gewürz is low acid, higher potential alcohol. So I'm curious how that plays into this wine.
It also builds some texture here. Yeah, that softer, more subtle acidity helps bend the blow really, because acid-wise, we do pick early for this product.
The Gewürz and the Riesling, or do you let the Riesling go a little?
No, we pick at the same time, but that Riesling is 17 Brix, and that Gewürz would be more like 19 or 20 and lower acidity. So, yeah, one cool thing about the Methode Ancestral is that you can let those grapes get 20, 22 Brix, and you can soften some acidity. And we experimented that with that style at Mauby this year, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I look forward to it. It's really fun. This is a neat opportunity. You and I don't get to spend as much time together as COVID, right? So it's just talking about wine remotely or whatever else. But I was very excited to be able to do this because obviously I adore sparkling wine. Who doesn't? Good for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just like eggs. And but to have, they're fantastic food wines. And when Thomas comes down, we're going to talk about rosé and also just discuss the versatility of sparkling wine. It isn't just celebratory, although it's brilliant, celebratory, right? But I could open up a really great old Burgundy or something else to celebrate. I don't need it to have bubbles. But it's been really fun to be able to explore these different styles. And what I like about what you're doing with the Charmat method is because there's a lot more uninteresting Charmat method wines than there are uninteresting traditional method wines, right? Because just by definition, there's going to be something that's going to happen. But you've managed to capture not only with that, and there's also some brilliant Charmat method wines. I mean, like I said, I have Italian wine, so I love it. But you've really managed to capture some of that transparency of the grape varietals. I would say also honoring where it's coming from. And I like that you've made some very unique decisions that you don't see a lot from up here. So I'm excited to see where this goes.
Thanks. Well, these are all three really great examples of well-made wine, so that helps. You're right.
We're not slighting it.
They're good and bad examples of all. So.
Oh, for sure. But it's nice to see these three examples from our area that showcase the area as well as like really fun winemaking decisions. And it's nice. And the C3 Pinot, the traditional method, I mean, we had that at Stella forever. I love that wine so much. It's so good. But
thank you.
Yeah, I wanted the opportunity to have a really great Charmat method that we could showcase with these. But if anyone's looking for the traditional method from these guys, there are a number of great examples too.
Thank you. Nice talking to you.
Yeah,
good to see you.
too. And Michael will be around for questions after too. It's not an after party because there's no parties during COVID. but I am going to invite you to the lounge.
All right.
Please keep your wide distance from my friend Thomas, who's coming up next.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, again, from Mobby and bigLITTLE. And now I'm really excited. So I have a friend who's coming. We've been friends for probably a decade or so, I guess. We've lived here for a couple months. My friend Houseman has worked all over the world and joined us just this summer as Ocean Peninsula's newest winemaker with Lads Winery. And it's an absolute pleasure to be able to sort of make his little debut on our Facebook Live. So for all 3 people watching, just kidding. It's really exciting. So it's interesting because part of you're finishing wines and you haven't actually had a whole thing yet. But since I've known you, it's like sparkling wine and Fernet Branca. So that's been like the beverage of choice. Not to mention all this extraordinary Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, blah, 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 whatever, right? We're talking about bubbles and later Fernet Branca. So bubbles first, before we start talking about you and 2 Lads, I want, just give me your whatever on the sparkling and the production method and what you're seeing so far and what you tasted today, because we heard from the people who actually made the wine, but you're this unique perspective.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that this is a really wonderful kind of, not necessarily a focused window. I think that it's a nice broad look. And it's beautiful to see that in such a small region, there's so many different voices and ways of doing things. And I think that's, the most interesting part of this collection of wines here is that not only are the production methods different, but the wines themselves are completely unique. And that says a lot. I think that when you have really great grapes to start from, it's easy to not only, as you said earlier, kind of maintain the integrity of the variety, but also be able to kind of riff on it a little. And you see that quite well.
Does this excite you? I mean, literally, you just finished your first time.
No, totally. Yeah, and it's interesting because, for me, I walked into a winery right before harvest that I had never been in before and had never used the equipment and had never been in the vineyards. And as a sparkling winemaker, I have a decade of this, and I've been working with the same tiny block of grapes the entire time, and watched it change as I learned more about making sparkling wine. And then you walk into somebody else's winemaking shoes from the same thing. It's it's a state fruit. I can literally walk from one block to the next block with all the varieties in 2 minutes. And yet I see what that gives at 2 Lads, but I also see how I'm going to insert myself in it and do what these wines have done and steer it in a different direction.
So for those who don't know, which is probably a lot of people, I would imagine, Thomas, you work in New Zealand, Otago, so like the southern part, cooler climate part of New Zealand, and also altitude. Anderson Valley. Cooler part of California, and the most recently, prior to here, Willamette Valley,
which was
Oregon.
17 years.
Right. And so you're here and you have what could arguably be a global perspective of what's happening. I want to know.
Almost always been at the 45th parallel. Central Otago's 45th parallel, Oregon's 45th parallel.
Because of you, that was almost the topic of like, when is Thomas going to come? And I'm like, it's December, we have new bubbles, and he loves those too. We'll do the 45th parallel another time.
But it's kind of interesting to ride that line across and see how it changes.
In both of them.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it's interesting because I think that if you were to look at all those regions, that Old Mission to me is more like Central Otago than any of the other regions.
Tell me why, because I think of skiing. I guess we have that here too.
Well, Central Otago is old. It's like a lot of the vineyards are on mine tailings, so it's almost sand and gravel.
Wow.
It's like left over from the gold rush there, and then it's a continental climate. So
as opposed to most of the rest of New Zealand, which is more maritime.
Well, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. But you have a mountain range there that
so
blocks everything, and it's like the most southern part of New Zealand, so that when the wind comes in, it's coming from Antarctica.
Right.
So when the wind comes in here, it's coming from Arctica. Not anti-Arctic,
Right.
So it's like you have these very cold winters, you have these very porous soils, and then you have these quite dramatic changes in temperature between, and so you have a very delayed spring, and it's an arid climate, which this isn't, but to me it reminds me the most of the places that I work of Central Ohio.
Are you excited?
I am excited.
I mean, it's your first vintage.
Yeah,
here.
no, totally.
You
And
brought in.
I think that for our first vintage, Michigan was very gentle to me. I always hear these, oh God.
That's because we want you to stay, Tom.
Oh, yeah. Well, so far so good. Yeah. Yeah.
It's exciting for me because, like I said, buying wine from around, all over, obviously, like the world, and having known you, like as a producer from another place that I've known and liked, and all things, you're here. You're literally here.
Yeah, right down the road.
And then these guys that I spend so much time with and have for 20 years now almost, right, that are making wine here and have been waving this flag for this sort of marginalized wine region, right? We're on the fringe, we're on the edge. Yeah. Like Michigan is still so new, where Willamette Valley, not so much, but here you are.
But Willamette Valley, 20 years ago.
Correct.
I feel like we're where we are.
But qualitatively, I feel like and there's crappy wine in every region, you know that. I mean, the best regions in the world, there's super garbage wine, right? So whatever. So we make great wine here. Willamette Valley makes great wine. Lead, right?
Well, I think that it really comes down to, I think we're lucky in that we have this thing which we're on right now called the internet, which wasn't the case.
What internet?
Yeah. Oh, there's not internet.
What do you mean the internet?
We're just talking to a barrel.
Just that's my big ruse.
Oh my God, I'm talking to a barrel.
Actually, several
best joke ever. But what I was going to say is that when Oregon came into its being, there was no internet. When a lot of these regions, came into their own being, there are stories of the Willamette Valley, like them all getting together in a station wagon and throwing boxes of wine, having to drive around the country, driving to Chicago, and showing their wines. And nobody had any idea, what Oregon was, and they had to work so hard. Whereas now we can sit here in this wonderful barrel hall and talk to whomever wants to tune in, and that's a different story.
And I think there's a nice generation of people too who are really open-minded. Like you have this younger generation of people who it doesn't have to be yellow label blue Clicquot. Not that there's anything super wrong with it, just a little bit wrong with it. It's fine. I can say it. It's fine. But you know what I mean, right?
Right.
It's open-minded where they don't need that brand recognition. They're happy to say, yeah, I'm super into this.
Well, I was just saying this about my nephew who's up here making wine with me from California. I poached him for vintage, but it's so funny. If I need to do something, generally I'll figure it out, or I'll look it up, or I read a book. I've never seen him read a book, but anytime anything happens, the first thing he does is he gets on his computer, he finds the information, whether it's on YouTube or manual or whatever. And it's the same thing about wine, is that you can look up everything about a region, everything about a wine, whatever you want. It's online, and having that computer in your pocket changes the story that we have getting out to people. Like if we can reach some people, like the way that media is shared is very different. A lot of the work is done.
It allows growth like exponentially in a way, or at least awareness.
I think it allows people to not have to listen to one or two reviewers to tell them what they like.
Yeah.
It allows them to figure it out and find it on their own, because most people are going to go with it.
So we do have a question for you.
Yeah.
From our friends out there in the inter-ether
Web
space, all the things. What is your most memorable? The most important, the sparkling wine. Because you are, as long as I've known you, like bubblehead extraordinary.
Oh, I love bubbles.
Yes. So can you even pick one? I can never do that. When people ask me that question, I'm like,
it's
are you
easy
crazy?
for me. I'm a huge fan of the Cooch.
Okay, you'll have to explain that a little bit more, my friend.
I don't think it's actually called Cooch. I think it's spelled Cooch. It's a.
Can we say that on live TV? Or?
We did.
Okay, well, yes, we
I think I
can.
said cooch 3 times, not 4.
No F-bombs, but feel free to say that.
It's a grower. It's a grower champagne, the small producer. I believe it was probably the first all organic grower champagne.
All right, someone out there look it up quickly.
It's delicious.
I believe.
And for me, it's always been, until this is the first vintage, it's always been the one that I toast the beginning of vintage and the end of vintage. And I moved to Michigan, and I have not had the cooch since I moved here.
Wow.
No cooch in Michigan.
Don't tell people that. Actually, keep telling people that, but no one will come here ever again.
Oh,
We
man,
have a
cooch
little
list.
pristine shoreline.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the secret of Michigan, right?
Yeah.
So just to bring it back to Bubbles, you're new, you're here, but you're not new. You're like a veteran winemaker, but you're new to our area. This has always been a frontier, like an exciting place, an exciting palette, a playroom, if you will, right, for winemakers and sparkling wine. And obviously being in a cooler climate, we have that. But what excites you the most?
Well, okay, as I said, I've been making, I've had a decade of working with one place, but I've also been a part of a very, 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 like your very tight community of sparkling winemakers, and it has grown exponentially in 10 years. But it's the first time, this is the first time ever in making sparkling wine where I brought in fruit. I believe somebody talked earlier about like the balance, it may have been Brian, talked about the balance of when to bring in sparkling wine. And for me, it's less about, I hate to say this, but it's not balanced. It's about like where the sugar and the acid is, and you can't like crest over it. You want to have flavor. But this is the first time in my career that I've ever brought in fully ripe grapes at sparkling chemistry.
Would it be super weird to say that we sort of popped your cherry in that regard, just going at the whole?
I think that topping a cherry on an old Mission Peninsula is too easy.
I can't.
Meredith, no talking.
And everything's about cherries here.
All right, I know that was ridiculous, but I could help. I could help myself. So we do a Q&A. We have a number of questions coming in right now. Thomas is going to stay here with me and ask, and then we have our other winemakers upstairs also willing to ask questions. And we have some fun questions. Thank you, Thomas.
Of course, thank you.
Of course. Thank you. I'm so excited to read this. One of the things that makes 2020 potentially not a completely crappy year, the fact that you came here.
Wow, I'm better
I
than
also
COVID.
that. I wish I could be really enthusiastic about that, but it's so a couple of questions that we do have, and this is a great one. So people talk about, and I would say not just with sparkling wine, but also with rosé. Like, what makes that decision? So you have cool climate, and I might have Brian take this one, especially because of just the breadth of wines that you make at What's with Charlie, Brian. But people talk about making, like, if you make that decision on the fly that it's too cold, so everything's going to be sparkling this year, or all my reds are going to be rosé this year. And Brian, take that, and then anyone else who wants to weigh in, please do. All right, do we not know where Brian is? Is he there?
I saw him on a sofa.
Brian's napping.
Yeah. You have to unmute. You need to. Yeah.
All right, there we go. Right? Am I here?
Ready for his question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I'm repeating the question. So I'm listening to the echo from the upstairs.
I am.
So the
What if I
question
just come down
basically
there?
is,
Would that be easier?
We know that in the cooler vintages, sometimes red wine might not work out, or regular still wine might not work out. When do you make that decision to turn wine into a sparkling wine, or turn wine into a rosé as opposed to a still wine?
Well, we planted specific vineyards for that reason. So for us, we're going for sparkling wine every year in those same vineyards. And rosé, we're trying to figure out which vineyards are best for rosé to have the same philosophy. So I don't decide during the vintage. We already decided. No? Sibilance testing. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah, I'm just looking at other questions. I actually not reading glasses. This is a little more challenging. Someone put up a question about bottle shape. So with sparkling wine, we're obviously not talking about Bordeaux with the shoulder bottle or the sloping burgundy side bottle, but it's really less a question of shape as it is about like sturdiness.
Oh gosh.
Right? So will you talk about that, Thomas, the content under pressure and why it's important to have that thicker glass?
Well, yeah, I think that, first of all, you have to have a bottle that, so this, actually, I'm going to turn this into another. So I have made these style of wines. The only one I haven't made is ancestral.
Okay.
But I've also done forced carbonation. And the first wine that I started making when I first started was more like Vino Verde, where you're trying to maintain just whatever amount of CO2 is in the tank from fermentation, keep it ice cold, and then you end up with something that's frizzante.
But very slight bubbles. And we didn't get into all the complexity.
Right, but it can be significant depending on, and so over the years I would find ways to keep it colder and colder and colder and bottle it cold and maintain enough CO2. And I was doing this in a regular standard bottle with a screw cap and a very tight liner so that it would hold in all the carbonation. And I got so good at that the last year that I did it in that bottle, we were having problems when we would ship it out, when they would bring the cases and they would bring them into a restaurant and like drop them off, and the bottom of the bottle would break at the pump because there was enough pressure inside the bottle and the glass wasn't sturdy enough that it was cracking. The top was holding the pressure, but the bottle. So they're substantial bottles, and they're designed to hold pressure. But I think that most of them also have a shoulder on them, so that when they're doing Shiraz, when they're doing
more of a sloping shoulder,
right?
So you can get it.
So that you're getting all of the leaves to accumulate in the bottle.
I think we need to do bubbles another time as well, segment 2, because we didn't really get a chance to talk about sweetness levels. We didn't talk about different types of bubbles, right? Because there's so much. The conversation could go on forever, and we didn't even talk about how bubbles become pink. Right now, I think it's a wrap for 2020 for Lads Barrel Room. Maybe this time. We'll be tailgating, so if anyone wants to chime in, you can get to us personally, knock yourselves out. In the meantime, I want to thank Thomas and welcome as well. It's kind of like your first official public appearance, as public as this is, as an old Mission Central winemaker. Of course, our other guests are the winemakers, Michael Lang from bigLITTLE and Mobby, Sean O'Keefe from Anne Amie Vineyards, and our gracious host, spectacular winemaker, Sherpa all things, Brian Ulbrich from Lads Winery, and again, Christy, Meredith, and Elena in the background, kindly handling all the things that the rest of us are terrible at. So thank you so much. We do have another one coming up in January. Stay tuned to social media. Fortunately, it's not me driving it. And cheers. Drink something fizzy. Yeah? Cheers. Hey.